focus energy resources and their role in decarbonizing electricity. So first, please join me in acknowledging the traditional owners of the various lands from which we're joining this seminar, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. So this seminar is being hosted by Melbourne Climate Futures Academy and the Climate and Energy College Alumni Network, and it's the first in a series of 3 seminars on the climate and energy. The later part of this seminar will be run as a Q&A session, and we'll open the floor to questions. And please, for those online, use the raise hands icon, which can be found at the bottom of your Zoom screen under reactions. Okay, so I'll just introduce our speaker. So Martin Kittel is a research associate at the German Institute for Economic Research, or DIW Berlin, as well as a PhD candidate at the DIW Berlin Graduate Center and Berlin Technical University. His research focuses on model-based analysis of the decarbonization of European electricity markets and the role of flexibility options for the integration of variable renewable energy. So Martin holds degrees in business management and business administration and economics from Dresden Technical University, and has spent 2 semesters at Teesside University in the UK. So thank you very much, and look forward to hearing the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Calum, for these very warm words. I have the honor of kicking off the seminar series. And before we start, I just want to seize the opportunity and articulate my appreciation for both, first, that I can talk here in Melbourne, but then also for Calvin, because I witnessed over the past weeks how much effort and work went into setting up and organizing these seminar series. So again, thanks for that. So yeah, today I want to introduce a tool that is able to systematically evaluate variable renewable energy droughts. First, I'm going to set the scene and motivate the topic a bit, pose some research questions.
Let's open you here. Yeah, sorry.
Oops, is that working? It's not working. Bear with us, guys. There we are right now. Okay, so after setting the scene, I want to introduce what the tool actually does. So introduce the method. And then I would like to showcase and illustrate some features of the tool by briefly discussing 2 case studies, one on Europe with focus on Germany and one on Australia. But please let me mention, these are preliminary results. So please take everything with a grain of salt. In the end, I want to conclude and then, of course, also discuss future work. So let's start. What we see here is the generation from variable renewable energy sources, so solar PV, wind onshore and wind offshore. This area here in Germany in February 2022. And what we also see is here the demand for electricity. And while the variability of a renewable power sector is clearly visible, we can imagine scaling up the generation capacities of these technologies. Eventually, variable renewable energy will be able to meet demand in many, many hours of the year. However, if we move forward in our running examples, just a couple of weeks, what we come across is a variable renewable energy drought. So visible here. And these droughts are periods, long-lasting periods with very low availability of generation from these technologies. And of course, as our transition towards renewable energy systems keeps on going and progresses, our supply side will become increasingly dependent on the variability of variable renewable energy sources. And so will, of course, the drought periods become increasingly challenging to our energy systems, which in the end need to be designed to cope with this variability. So we can basically pose 3 research questions. First, how severe are actually these variable renewable energy droughts in terms of duration, but also in terms of frequency? When do they occur? Is there like a seasonal pattern that we come across? And also in terms of interannual variability, do we see differences in terms of the most extreme periods? And then third, thinking about multi-regional settings, is there a correlation, a spatial correlation to these drought patterns? There's heaps of studies out there coming both from the domain of climate scientists and energy system modelers, modeling on the variability of renewables, and also on these drought periods. So let me just maybe mention one study here, namely the first one, Ohlendorf and Schill. What they did is they investigated low wind periods in Germany for onshore wind for a record of about like 35 years. And what they found is that the most extreme period in terms of duration, so the longest lasting period, occurred in the year 1985 and lasted about 10 days. And I'm going to pick up on this result later on. So let's come to the tool. What does it actually do? How can we define a drought period? And for this, I'm going to use the notion of a capacity factor. Just for those of you who are not aware of this concept, a capacity factor is just a number between 0 and 1, which essentially just tells you how much energy of a certain technology is available in a certain time step, say 1 hour, in relation to the total installed capacity in an area. All right. So there are 2 established definitions of droughts in literature. And here in this tool, I'm also building upon these definitions. The first one being constantly below threshold, which defines a drought as a sequence of consecutive hours with a capacity factor below a certain drought threshold. So the drought threshold here is this gray line. And this line is the time series of capacity factors. And as we can see here, the green areas, these are CBT constantly below threshold droughts. But what we also see is that there are intermediate periods, brief periods with a generation just above the critical threshold. However, this entire period here, what we see, is still characterized by very scarce generation, by very scarce availability. So there's another concept, which is called the mean below threshold, which picks up on exactly that, because it allows for these intermediate periods with a little bit more of generation by defining a drought as a series of consecutive hours with a moving average below this drought threshold. And how do we count these droughts now? And what I want to introduce here is the definition of an energy drought event. And this event means that there is a qualified period, either according to this MBT, this mean below threshold, or the constantly below threshold notion, with just any duration. Yeah, so the tool will capture in the end any event, no matter how long it is. Each event is counted only once, and this is done by a descending order of the search algorithm. So the search algorithm starts with very, very long-lasting durations, say half a year or so, finds and identifies qualified drought periods, and then removes these hours from the consideration. And then after that, it decreases the period duration, scans again, removes the relevant aspects, the relevant hours for the drought periods, and so on. So this way you ensure that every event is only counted once. Let's look at an example. What we see here is an example with 3 CBT events, 1, 2, 3 here. And if we were to count them now, we could say we see 3 events lasting at least 12 hours, 2 lasting at least 52 hours, and then 1 lasting at least 65 hours. However, bear in mind, these 3 events essentially make up 1 MBT event lasting about, like, say, 150 hours in this very example here. And how do we interpret that? Well, what we see here is the exact duration and the frequency of these drought periods, of these scarcity periods in the end. which is a very good indicator for the flexibility needs of future renewable energy systems. So now that we have established what the tool actually does and what we understand when we say there's a drought, let me illustrate a few features by discussing two case studies. The first one is variable renewable energy droughts in Europe for the target year 2030. For the analysis, I used 3 drought thresholds, 2%, 5%, and 10%. So the capacity factors that I mentioned earlier on, which is just very much inspired by literature and exogenously set. For the analysis, I used data from the European Network of Transmission System Operators for Electricity, and they provide hourly capacity factors for the target year 2030 for a record containing 35 years. And they also provide for these scenarios, for the 2030 scenario, assumptions on the configuration of the target system in 2030. So what's the capacity mix in 2030? And I use these data sets to first analyze each VRE technology individually, just to see what kind of characteristic it has. And then also I combine the time series of capacity factors weighted by their installed capacity, of course, in order to see, okay, what is happening if we look at a combined VRE technology portfolio. Okay, let's start with some results. What we see here are results for MBT, so mean below threshold droughts in Germany. And as of now, all the results I'm going to show you are mean below threshold, just for your understanding. And we see here the average frequency per season. So on the horizontal axis, we see the duration of these drought periods, from short durations to longer lasting durations in hours, right? And this is plotted against their average frequency, averaged across the entire record of 35 years, in order to achieve the annual average frequency per season. And what we see when we look for, when we analyze onshore wind, is that during the European summer and spring, these drought periods are more frequent compared to the European winter, for a threshold of 10%. If we now look at more severe drought periods, for example, taking a threshold of 2%, so there's really just very, very, very little renewable availability in these periods. For shorter periods, the pattern above still holds. However, they converge for longer lasting periods. Also, what we of course see is that they are not as frequent if we decrease the scarcity threshold, the drought threshold. So how does it look like when we analyze a combined portfolio of wind onshore, offshore, and PV? Well, what we see is that there is a change in the seasonality in relation to the duration of these drought periods. So drought periods up to, say, roughly a day or so are more frequent in summer and in spring, while the longer lasting periods are more frequent in winter, in the cold period in Europe, which of course sucks a little bit because the demand in winter in Europe is just way higher. Yeah, and if we now decrease the threshold again and look at the very severe droughts, we see that there's only one seasonal characteristic, namely the droughts are more frequent in winter, and those are really the ones that will pressurize our future energy systems the most. How does it look like with the most extreme periods? So what we see here is the duration of the most extreme period per year. The duration is plotted in days on the vertical axis. On the horizontal axis, we see each weather year, each year of the analyzed time series for our different thresholds. And what we find is that in the data set that I analyzed, the year 2010 apparently experiences the most severe droughts, the longest lasting droughts of 61 days based on a threshold of 10%. And let me just compare this to previous literature. The study that I mentioned earlier found that the longest, that for this threshold of 10%, the most extreme period with the longest duration occurred in the year 1985 and lasted only 10 days. So, you know, this suggests that previous literature might have underestimated the problem. However, you know, this merits really future investigation because there are certain aspects that need to be considered when stating that. So please take that with caution. One reason, for example, is that the other study, Ondorf and Schill, they used a different data set. So that might, of course, drive results a little bit. If we now look at a combined technology portfolio, the good news is that the longest period reduces. So please, you know, mind the difference here in scale of the axis. But wind onshore, the longest period is 61 days. While if we combine variable renewable energy technologies, it reduces to 26 days only. So this is, of course, very good news. Combining the portfolio or combining different technologies really helps to balance out these drought periods. But note that as compared to wind, here, the year 1998 seems to be the worst year for a threshold of 10%. And unfortunately, it's not that easy because if we base our analysis on a threshold of 5%, the year 2007 is the most extreme year with, I think, a duration of 7 days in total. So what we learn from this, from these two plots is first, of course, a combination of different technology really helps smoothing the extremes, which is very good news. But then another insight that is very relevant for energy systems modeling is that the selection of a relevant weather year really matters. Otherwise, you may really miss the point of the most extreme period, and your target or your ideal configuration of your target system that your models cover up may miss the point and may not be suitable to really deal with extreme weather conditions. So what about seasonality? What we see here again is the most extreme period plotted for each month of the year. And then again, the duration on the vertical axis. And what we see is that while for onshore wind, the most extreme periods are most pronounced in summertime, when looking or when combining all technologies, these most extreme periods are more pronounced in wintertime. So there's a clear seasonality visible depending on the technology or the technology mix that you use for your analysis and that you also want to use later on in your energy system. So far, we've only seen results on Germany, but how does it look like in a European context? What we see here is the Pearson correlation for our combined technology portfolio for very bad and long-lasting droughts, namely droughts lasting longer than 2 weeks for a threshold of 10%. And I'm so sorry, there's a typo here. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. What we see is that there's a strong variation, of course, across Europe. First of all, there are certain countries that do not even experience these very bad droughts. So, for example, Spain, France, southern Norway, and Portugal. So that's, of course, very good news. But what we also see is that there are certain country clusters with a very high correlation of these really, really bad periods. So for example, UK with Belgium and the Netherlands, or Denmark and Germany. And of course, this is driven by their regional vicinity, right? They're not really far away from each other. But this is a very important finding for system planners, because these regions are not really suitable for geographically or for spatial balancing of these extremes of variable renewable energies. So they should rather consider using a lot of like using other flexibility options such as long-term storage. The good news is there's also areas with really low correlation of these very bad or long-lasting droughts. So for example, within Sweden, it's not as bad, and Sweden can use, for example, a strong transmission grid to balance out the extreme variability of the renewable power sector. All right, so these were a few results on Europe. What about Australia now? What I did here is I took data from the integrated system planning report for the national Australian market, so the eastern part of Australia, so to say. And in their report, the system operator provides heaps of very potent renewable energy zones. And just to begin with, I picked a few. So for Queensland one, for New South Wales one, for Victoria one, for Tasmania one, and for South Australia, just one of these zones. And the record contains weather years of contains 8 weather years in total. Again, the same drought threshold, so the analysis is more or less the same here. And then what I did, I looked at PV and onshore wind individually. So I did not yet. I have not yet combined those to a combined technology portfolio. And why is that? Well, because this is very early stage analysis. So this will merit future analysis then. Okay, let's look at a few results. So first, starting with PV, what we see is that in terms of the most extreme events per year, there's of course a very large variation. So while Victoria and Tasmania, while these areas experience very long-lasting droughts, areas like Queensland and South Australia and New South Wales, there it's not as bad. So this is of course very good news. Also, compared to onshore wind, for example, in Europe, what we see is that the variation across years is not as high, which just means that the generation of PV is just more stable and more reliable here in Australia, especially in the northern areas. What we can say, of course, is that, for example, 2017 seems to be the most extreme year, which then again is, that's important for model-based analysis that they pick the relevant year. But it's not, if you chose another year here, apparently the difference is not that bad. How about seasonality across the year? Well, what we find is that especially Victoria and Tasmania experience long droughts during the Australian winter now. And the good news is that, for example, Queensland and South Australia and New South Wales, they also have droughts in winter, in June. But then these massive, these extreme periods, they decline in duration. And in, for example, July, August, and September, those areas could generate electricity to balance off these extreme periods in Tasmania and Victoria. But this is also very important for Tasmania again, because Tasmania, being connected to Victoria only, cannot rely on Victoria to supply their demand when these extreme periods occur. In the end, what we see here is a call or it makes a good case for a strong interconnection across the entire NEM area. What about the spatial temporal correlation of these droughts? Well, what we see is, again, Victoria and Tasmania, there the correlation is really bad. So there's a certain likelihood that whenever there's a long-lasting severe drought occurring in Tasmania, it might also happen in Victoria. So that's really important for future system planning here. But what we also see, of course, is that, for example, Queensland and New South Wales, the correlation between these droughts, that's not as high. So they could, for example, really use the transmission grid to balance these extremes. So let's look at onshore wind. First of all, what we see here are the most extreme events per year again. And what comes to mind is that there's more variation as compared to PV, which really just makes sense because wind is not as predictable and just more variable and more random in a way as PV. What we also see is that there are 3 very extreme years, so 2016, 2018, and 2021. That's important for energy systems modelers again. And then what we also know is, just keep in mind, PV 2015 was the most extreme year. So the point I'm trying to make here is it really depends on the system that you're looking at, on the configuration of the system, what area you're looking at, and what technologies you consider in your analysis in order to identify the most extreme and relevant years for getting robust energy system model outputs. How about seasonality again across those areas? Well, again, we see a little bit more of variation. And the very good news is that, for example, Queensland and New South Wales, they seem to be very complementary, right? So whenever Queensland experiences these droughts, New South Wales could step in and supply demand, and vice versa here in wintertime. Again, this calls for a very strong dam grid. Also, Tasmania and Victoria, they are very similar, so that's also important to consider, and again makes a strong case for applying long-term duration storage in these areas. What about the correlation again? Well, first of all, mind the scale here. It's very low, so that's very good news. But this is, of course, also driven because we're talking about areas that are very distant to each other. But still, it's an interesting finding because apparently these droughts are not correlated at all, which is, I guess, very good news because there are different weather regimes at work across Australia that future energy systems can exploit. All right, so we've seen many results now. Let's conclude. What have we seen? In terms of these drought patterns, it became evident that there's a big regional variation across Europe and across Australia, and I suppose the same will hold for India and China and whatsoever. So that's important to know. There's also a big technological variation. We've seen that single technologies might experience very large extremes, and we've seen also this smoothing effect of combining various technologies together. We've seen a variation in seasonality. Some technologies experience seasonality in winter or like really bad periods in winter. Some may do so in summertime. Again, there might be even complementary regions that can work together to balance these variable renewable energy extremes. And we've also seen the spatial temporal correlation, which may reveal interesting implications for the long-term system planning, especially in terms of flexibility options. So go rather for transmission or long-term storage, for example. In terms of energy system modeling, one point I really want to highlight again, and this was also one of the reasons that motivated this work in the beginning, it is very important to use multiple weather years. Just one weather year, just any weather year, you may totally miss the point and your target system will not be able to cope with weather variability in the future, right? The transition it takes decades, it costs loads of money, and if our target system that we build that we strive for is just not suitable or is not able to cope with weather variation, then yeah, that's going to be a problem because we need to decarbonize our energy systems. So the tool helps to identify relevant weather years for any specific setting. And there, with relevant weather years, I mean like a very good year, a very bad year, and more or less an ordinary year, to understand, okay, what do we need to cope for? And my personal target with this tool is to come up with a list of relevant years. And then this will also benefit the energy systems modeling community, because they then know, okay, for Australia or for Victoria, if I consider all possible technologies, then I should probably run my models over this and that weather year, and then hopefully I will receive very robust model outcomes. Let's look ahead. The tool is still work in progress, right? One major flaw of all these results I've shown you so far is that they use exogenously set thresholds. And the problem with this is that there's a certain bias to this procedure. So just imagine you have two regions with just one technology, and you apply the threshold exogenously set of 0.1. And now you think about, I don't know, say it's wind or it's PV. And now you have one region with an average capacity factor of 0.15 and another region with an average capacity factor of 0.25 or so. The region with the lower average capacity factor will, just by design of this algorithm, experience longer lasting droughts, just because the scarcity threshold, this drought threshold, is really close to the average capacity factor. And then, of course, since the algorithm burns the hours, so it removes the hours from the consideration, you will totally miss what is happening during this very, very long period. So these are just two effects of that. So in the end, in order to achieve comparability between regions or between different technologies, what needs to be done is an adjustment for the full load hours of every region and every technology. This is, for example, future work. Another development that I would like to implement is compound events. So not only combining different technologies, but also combining this with the temperature dependent demand for electricity. This will then, for example, offer or provide more insights on the actual storage need in terms of both energy and also capacity at every hour. And as I said, or as I tried to convince you, is every setting is different and every data set probably is different. And in order to enable the community to really find and identify relevant weather years, I want to go open access and open source with the tool, so that every modeler can just apply the tool in advance before running the actual analysis. In terms of future analysis, you have seen that it takes additional, or the additional technologies need to be considered, and additional technology mixes. So offshore wind, for example, in Australia or in Norway, hydropower is very important and dominant in their energy mix. So this also needs to be included. Also, of course, additional regions, because what we see here is the map of these renewable zones of the integrated system planning report that I mentioned earlier. And I picked only a few, but you can see that, for each state, there are so many of these green zones, of these most suitable or most potent zones. And of course, insights on the temporal spatial correlation, for example, they become more meaningful once you include all those zones, because then you can really find out, okay, can New South Wales and Queensland, for example, work together in balancing these extremes? Another aspect that is important is climate sensitivity. So how do these patterns change in the future as climate change progresses? Is there a change in the patterns? So, for example, you could think about different RCPs in this regard. Currently in Europe, there is an update undertaken of this database I used for the analysis for Europe. And what they want to include is they want to integrate also different weather projections dependent on different RCPs. So RCPs, maybe I should mention what this actually means. The representative concentration pathways from the IPCC. So different realizations of weather dependent on the emission level in the end, in the atmosphere. There are also many possible energy system modeling applications. So what I really be interested in is what is the spread, or what is the variation of optimal investment decisions in our energy models given different weather years. So we take a very good year and we take a very bad year, and then we see how far are actually the results apart, just to understand what does it mean to have robust results here, and how much could we potentially underestimate actually the need for flexibility options in our models. And then of course there's also potential application for work that has been done at the intersection of climate science and energy system modeling. So for example, the conversion of data of weather variables like wind speeds into energy variables like capacity factors. There you could also apply the tool and try to see whether you could, for example, arrange or adjust a little bit the regional distribution of capacity throughout Victoria or throughout Australia, for example, in order to minimize the problem of these variable renewable energy droughts. So as you can see, applications are just very numerous. And if somebody of you wants to team up, I'm very happy to cooperate, especially here in Australia. I think it would be very interesting to see what are actually the implications in terms of energy system modeling. And with this, I'd like to thank for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion and questions.
Oh, wonderful. So I'm just making sure that we've got those participants open. Okay, so for those of you who've raised your hands or want to speak in the audience, I'll be inviting you to unmute the audio and ask your questions. But before asking a question, please introduce yourself, your name and your affiliation, and then we can proceed with that. Okay, so Dylan, you've got a question.
Hello, is that yes? Excellent. Okay, thanks, Martin. It's very, very interesting presentation. Dylan McConnell, soon to be at UNSW. I've got plenty of questions and perhaps suggestions or things that you could consider, but I'll just start with, I think, a simple-ish one. I noticed that there was basically no weather droughts, renewable energy droughts in France and Spain, I think it was. And that seemed very surprising to me, given their proximity to Germany or the other countries that do have weather droughts. I was interested if you had any reason as to why that was the case.
Yeah, so let me rephrase your statement. What we've seen, I can go back also my slides. So the key aspect is that what we see here is only very long-lasting droughts. So the correlation of all those droughts that last longer than 2 weeks, right? So this does not mean that there are no droughts at all in these areas, but there are just no droughts that are very long-lasting. And this is, of course, driven by the very high capacity factor of PV in these areas. But I mean, I can also show you later on bilaterally. There are, of course, there's also, you can compute the correlation matrix also for shorter periods, and then they will also appear, of course.
Okay, I'll just invite Rob G to ask your question.
Hi, it's Rob Gardner from Renew. A couple of questions. One is on offshore wind. Have you done any figuring on that? Because my understanding is it's quite a different pattern to onshore wind.
You mean in the Australian context?
In the Australian context. And it could be the same in the Danish context too, I suppose.
I have not done so in the Australian context, but of course I plan to do that. As I said, this is very early stage work, but it has to be included in order to derive meaningful insights on the drought patterns for our combined VRE portfolio. So it'll be done in the future.
And the second one is the Australian eastern states anyway, is all one grid, though the capability of moving power from one part to another is limited. But I think you need to include all that in, and perhaps include the impacts of adding additional transmission contacts. So Marinus 2, for instance, from Tasmania to Victoria, which then goes off to everywhere else.
Absolutely, that's a very good comment, and that's one potential insight that you can derive, that this analysis really suggests that a strong interconnection of the NEM area is very beneficial in order to deal with these droughts.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next in person.
So I'm Ryan. I'm part of Melbourne Climate Futures Academy, also School of Geography. I think it's a big acronym now, SGAS. Anyways, thanks, Martin. Wonderful presentation. Thank you. Just to clarify, the VRE, so the combined in this tool, in this model, in this situation was wind and PV only?
So in the European setting, it was on and offshore wind and PV.
Okay. And then in those scenarios, and when you get those outputs from the model, is there a way on the back end that kind of indicates where that could be made up from, kind of which renewable energy source?
You mean when you look at the combined portfolio?
Yeah. So when you look at our combined portfolio, is there anything like under the hood that kind of you can look at that indicates to whoever's using this tool, kind of, okay, you should, if you want to make up those droughts, you want to invest more in a certain energy source?
In the end, I think it's a combination of two tools. So this is a time series analysis based tool, which really just helps you identifying there are these tools, they have these and that characteristics. But then you can combine this with energy systems modeling, and these models, they are, in my point of view, way more, they are powerful and way more suitable to answer, for example, this question, how to deal with these droughts. If this answers your question.
Yeah, I guess I was looking at, is there a way to like pull out those certain variables from each renewable that's an input into that kind of coupled model?
That's a good question. I mean, what you eventually could do is you could run the tool based on single technologies, and then for the combined technology portfolio, and then just compare what is happening in order to make sense what is causing all these variability in the combined case. So
so looking at kind of which ones, I guess, having the most influence on the outcome.
Yeah. Okay,
cool. And then my last comment would be, part of my research right now is downscaling a lot of climate factors for Australia, a lot of for the CMIP6 models. And so part of that's temperature, wind, rain, things like that. And so if you want to talk about how that could be implemented into that, or whoever wants to in the future, let me know.
Yeah, excellent. I'd be happy to. Thanks.
Okay. I've got one question online. Yep. So just invite Megan Doyle to speak.
Hi, I'm Megan Doyle. I'm a student at Duke University, and I just wanted to know what led to you choosing a 2-week definition for the droughts when looking at correlation. What was the reasoning behind that? Why didn't you choose a smaller time frame? Because you said that the correlations vary a lot depending on the time phrase chosen.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a good question. Maybe let me validate. What we see here on the slide is, of course, like all those droughts lasting longer than 2 weeks, because essentially these droughts will pressurize our energy systems, our renewable energy systems the most. However, the tool also provides a functionality to just plot, the correlation for any desired length. So I also did this for a day, 2 days, 1 week, 2 weeks, a month, and so on. So, it's really up to the user to use that in the end and to try to understand the results the best. It's just here for showcasing reasons. I've just, plotted this matrix here, or used this plot here. But in the end, maybe why I did this, at least in Germany, there's this widespread assumption that these droughts will last more or less 2 weeks. And my analysis clearly shows that it really depends on the definition of drought. Like, what do you understand as a drought? Where do you set the threshold, whether this assumption holds or not? And I hope in future work, when we do this full load hour adjusted thresholds, that we really can come up with like very robust and legit insights regarding this.
Okay, thank you, Megan. In here?
Hey, it's Dylan again. It was kind of a follow-up question to the one that Ryan asked, and perhaps Ryan might be a better place to answer it. It's a while since I've looked at this, but my understanding of downscaling, particularly wind, from the big climate, CMIP6 and other big global circulation model is quite difficult and fraught or highly uncertain. So I'd be interested to know if there's been any more developments on that, particularly when you're talking about quite discrete regional scales in the European context and the Australian context. I guess where is that at, and how certain or how good are the sort of downscaling efforts for some of those climate inputs?
That is a very good question, and I would like to get answered myself too. What I know is, I'm not really familiar with the Australian context, but I'm happy to dive into that, of course. But as I mentioned earlier on, this climate database, pan-European climate database developed by the transmission system operators in Europe, the first version is just it provides data on country level and on bidding zone level. So in Europe, many countries are split up in different bidding zones, and so you have data on that. But as I said, they want to update now the entire database, and I think there will be also more sub-regional configurations that you can use for whatever. But how good they are, I don't really know. I'm sorry, I cannot answer that. Maybe you have another take on that.
I could spend a lot of time on this, but I'll try and I think when it comes to downscaling, especially, I think, it depends on what variable you're looking at, and then also will depend on the historical basis for what you're doing that downscaling. So for example, Australia has a great database for gridded data for precipitation from Silo. And so, there's a lot of historical data to reference and get the bias of the GCMs to do that downscaling work. And that's just only one method of downscaling, where there's also areas where you can look into regional climate models. I know Europe has a couple. I know Queensland has one. And so those might be a better option, especially going to wind.
Thank you. This is Wolf Schill. I'm also with DRW Berlin and currently in Melbourne. So thanks, Martin, for the excellent presentation. And I'm very much looking forward to that rebuttal of this weirdo Ohlendorf and Schill paper. But seriously, you mentioned in the end that you also want to include other technologies, and totally understandable for offshore wind, but you also mentioned hydro. So Norway, etc. So given that that is largely reservoirs, which are not exactly variable as such, but they can produce pretty much in a controlled way, given like longer term inflow characteristics, do you have already an idea how to actually do that?
So I was at a conference in Norway earlier this year and also presented this project. And what they told me is that this year, apparently in spring, Norway experienced like massive droughts. And this caused the storage levels to be really low. So the, this idea that it's just firm and available throughout the year apparently is also not true. So you can, run this tool on, for example, inflow time series, just to get an idea like, okay, there might be seasonality to it, there might be a really bad year to it. And then, of course, you need to see what happens in the context of the energy system modeling activity to really find out what are the concrete implications. But I guess, since whenever you already find like a long-lasting drought of inflow, say have a year or so, that will already show you, okay, this is a relevant weather year, and you should use this for your modeling when you want to come up with a robust configuration of the future Norwegian energy system.
Thanks. But it seems, if I can just quickly follow up, that you mentioned already this divide. So everything you're doing here is providing, or it's providing insights in its own right, but it's useful to provide input parameters then for energy systems modeling. And it seems that this hydro thing is pretty much on the, so what you would do then with these limited inflows under perfect foresight, that would probably be more on the energy systems modeling side, right? Okay, thanks. Dylan.
Yeah, just a follow up on that. That's also a big issue in Australia, actually, drought years. And our system operator does actually explicitly include I think it's the 2008 weather year, because it is a drought year. So it is actually a big issue here as well. The Millennium Drought had a big impact on a lot of things, but particularly the power system. Well, of many things, one of them was the power system. So yeah, it would be interesting to look at that. But noting Wolf's comments, it's a harder thing to consider. The other thing, actually just while I remember it, I think the system operator actually uses 11 weather years in their current. So they keep adding one each year. But this is perhaps a bit of a philosophical question for you. Why, and something I often think about is, why should we use weather years? Why don't we have a full statistical representation of these systems for power system analysis, or even looking at this in general? That's something that I'm sort of interested in exploring myself, is actually moving away. And I think there's other people in, I think the States and other parts of the world that are actually moving away from looking at weather years for exactly this reason, that they are not necessarily representative and don't capture everything.
Yeah, that's a very good comment. And I think you motivated an entire PhD project there. It's very hard to generate this. And as far as I'm aware, they just don't simply exist, because it's not that easy to take all aspects of variability. I mean, it's not just droughts, it's also the RAMs, for example, and the volatility in general, and to first of all, identify all the relevant characteristics, and then somehow take them from weather years and squeeze them into one synthetic, more generalizable or more general weather year. It's a very good idea. And maybe, we can use the tool to just find relevant aspects in terms of droughts, but then there needs to be other tools that really identify the most characteristic patterns there. And then, yeah, it would be lovely to generate one of these representative generic years, but I think it's just not that easy. Yeah. And I think it's 2014 in the current ISP, the dry year. Ah, okay, possible, yeah. Also, so in the ISP, they provide actually a record of 30 years, and I looked at that, and there is some variation that probably depends on the leap day. Yeah.
So it's the same. It was. Oh, sorry. It was originally. I think it was 9 years. It was 8 years plus one drought year, and now I think it's 10 years plus one drought year. Maybe can't remember the specifics, but they roll them forward over the 30-year outlook period. So it's the same pattern of years. They may randomize the order. I think. I can't remember, but that's possibly why there's not that much variation, because they are repeating a lot of data in there.
Yeah. I mean, here I've used 8 years anyways, and I tried to understand their systematics, because I also read this that they just keep on rolling on the same weather years all over, but I was just not able to understand the system. So that's why I just took those that for the time being at least made the most sense. But yeah, it would be interesting to see that. And there is actually a report that has been released in July, I think, by colleagues from the
study
university.
Yeah,
the Gilmore study, and
Gilmore and Nelson.
Exactly. And they use a record of like 40 years or 35 years or so, and I'd love to get a hold on that. Yeah, so if you have the connection, I already asked them, but it didn't reply so far.
Sure.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Martin, and for your presentation and all the insights that you're providing everybody. Okay, so I'll just go to the final closeout. Oops. Oh. Okay, so once again, thank you, Martin, for your presentation. It was very interesting, and the opportunities for transmission planning and actually understanding where those elements lie, and to the degree to which you can, would certainly be very powerful for the energy system planners going forward. Okay, so overall details for upcoming events, I'll just close out. So please visit the Melbourne Climate Futures Academy and Climate Energy College alumni websites. And the next webinar is actually going to be Friday this week at 11 AM, and it'll be on how's the German energy vendor going and insights from the Open Energy Tracker, and presented by Wolf-Peter Schill, who's in attendance. Okay, so thank you everybody for attending, and thank you once again, Martin, for the presentation.
Thank you.